Hello, my name is Florian Fusseis, and Wenlu and Darran invited me to present the Norse arsenal to you. The Norse arsenal is essentially a set of X-ray and neutron transparent experimental devices that we develop and build here in Edinburgh to study fluid rock interaction and rock deformation mostly. Before I show you this array of cells, I would like to introduce our research group to you. We are Edinburgh Geoscience Microtomography, and although the group of course varies a bit in its size and composition, it is essentially Ian and myself here who lead this effort. We are very lucky to work with two very good postdocs at the moment. This is Alexis Cartwright-Taylor, who works on damage evolution and failure in rocks, mostly sandstones. I will show some of her work later. And Damien Freitard, who joined us from France, Clermont-Ferrand, recently, and who just started working on dehydration reactions and is also very active in designing and building new apparatus with us. We are also very lucky to work with a genius emeritus, Steve Elphick, here, who has a whole career worth of experience in designing and building high pressure apparatus, and helps us a lot in the more advanced developments that I will be showing you later. Our current PhD students here, the two that are mostly focusing on microtomography, are Berit Schwichtenberg here on the left hand side. Berit works a lot on pressure solution creep in salt, and Eli Yang here on the right hand side. Eli works on multiphase fluid flow in mostly carbonates. Derek Leung is doing a master's by research with us, and Derek is working on the damage evolution in curling stones. Some of our very successful alumni down here: Tanas Pak. Tanas did a PhD with us a couple of years ago on multiphase fluid flow. Also Alice Macente here, she's now running a CT facility in Glasgow. She worked on pressure solution creep. And Sina Marti worked with us as a postdoc until February this year. And Sina is she used to work on dehydration reactions. The work that I'm showing you today would not be possible without these four gentlemen: Alex Hart, Ivan February, Georgi Papp, and Bob Brown. Bob is retired now, but these constitute our workshop technicians. We are very lucky to have our own mechanical workshop in-house, and it's great fun and a great honor to work with these guys who build all the designs that we throw at them in-house pretty much. We are also working with Eddie Ando from Laboratoire 3SA in Grenoble. Eddie is an absolute guru in image correlation and image analysis, and he helps us a lot with that. We work with Christian Schleppütz and Federica Maron from SLS, mostly on the implementation of our rigs at Tomcat at the moment. And we used to work a lot with Shangwei Shao, who was at APS then, and Shangwei was really crucial in getting us started in in-situ imaging. I cannot acknowledge that highly enough. We are a firmly European research group, of course. We are at home in the beautiful Edinburgh, capital of Scotland, where we work at the School of Geosciences at the University of Edinburgh. And here we also have our own CT scanner, which Steve and Ian built a couple of years ago. We work a lot on various European light sources. We usually go to do experiments 2 to 3 times a year. Lately we have worked a lot at the diamond light source at I-12 Jeep. We have worked at Synchrotron Soleil, at Psyché with Andy King in the past years. Most of my immediate research happens at the Swiss light source at Tomcat at the moment. And we have also acquired neutron data at SYNC. That's also at the Paul Scherrer Institute at the Icon beamline, and at ILL, where we worked at the next beamline, which combines X-rays and neutrons for imaging. Why do we do 4D microtomography? I want to illustrate that point very quickly here on this table, which we used in a grant application recently. And this table here contrasts essentially on this side here various parameters that we are really interested in when we talk about rock deformation, fluid rock interaction, with various explorative techniques. And in the first column here, classical black box experiments. I call them black box experiments because despite rock deformation experiments, of course, have advanced substantially over the past century, actually, they are still somewhat limited by the fact that we cannot actually observe the sample, right? That we can only indirectly observe and monitor the sample, and as such we can determine the bulk strain evolution, for example, the bulk stress evolution. We can use acoustic emissions to monitor processes in the sample, even do tomography with that, but it's relatively inaccurate. And we can also, of course, say something about the bulk permeability evolution of the sample, right? Usually, once an experiment is completed in one of these apparatus, we extract the sample and then we can do a post-mortem evaluation, which gives us access to a couple more parameters, including, for example, the proportion of minerals that partook in deformation processes or metamorphic reactions, their spatial distribution, the percolation size, geometry, the orientation. However, of course, all of this can only be sort of determined for a post-experimental state, right? That's one snapshot in time that we take after the actual experiment and after the processes we're interested in ceased to be active. This is a severe limitation, of course, right? Either we can observe the sample as a bulk, but we cannot break down grain scale processes, or we can only observe grain scale phenomena after the actual process that we're interested in has ceased to happen, right? So all of these can be overcome with 4D in situ imaging experiments, and this is the primary reason why we find them so exciting to do. We can, of course, monitor bulk properties here, such as bulk strain, bulk stress. We can also listen to acoustic emissions in our samples. I'll show you that device later. We can determine the permeability. We have never tried to do that during an experiment, although it should be technically possible. We would be simulating that on actual 3D data. However, for the entire experiment, we can, and that's a full 4D evolution in time and space, we can essentially track every single grain. We can track every single grain that reacts, that deforms. We can have reported forms. We can determine its field state, whatever you want, really. So at the end of the day, we theoretically end up with a vast data set that really tracks the proportion, spatial distribution, percolation, size, geometry, orientation of each individual phase, each individual grain in our sample. And then using digital volume correlation techniques, we can also determine local strains on the grain scale. Tremendously difficult thing to do. And in a sense also make statements about the strain rate distribution in our sample, right? Another 2 points to keep an eye on, and they are good justification for doing 4D microtomography, is really that a single 4D experiment actually replaces tens to hundreds of individual classical experiments, right? Because every single 3D scan constitutes one of these classical experiments. And the other important process is, rather than quantifying processes on the bulk scale, we can quantify processes and determine rates on the grain scale, and I think that is also quite important. So these are all very nice realizations, very nice techniques to have access to, really. We did realize that a fair while ago, actually about a decade ago, and that's when we started doing 4D experiments at APS. And me, essentially being a field geologist, I had to learn experimental geosciences essentially the hard way. And we started with very simple experiments here. So at the time, Shangwei supported us in building an X-ray transparent furnace. That was a very simple furnace here, but it produced actually quite nice data. It allowed us to vary the temperature around the sample and look at certain temperature activated processes such as thermal cracking or dehydration. That furnace evolved massively, and a couple of years later it looked like this, and it was like super powerful and very efficient. But clearly only varying the temperature is, for geoscientists, is not really very satisfying in the long run. So in about 2012, 2013, I started to essentially pester people to help me build a first core holder, an X-ray transparent core holder that would allow us to also apply confining pressure to a sample, and this is a much evolved version. I'll show you more of that in a second. Since I came to Edinburgh, Ian and I, with others, have constantly sort of evolved and enlarged our repertoire, and usually the effort was driven by either the desire to do a particular experiment or something we found we could really improve on our existing equipment, and that is essentially what still drives us today. So today I'll be showing you mostly these four cells here. In fact, 3 cells, because these two are, that's an iteration of the same cell, and I won't be talking about these ones down here. The first cell I want to show you is Sleipnir, and you will notice that the Norse arsenal is not just referring to the north of the UK, but all of our cells are named after sort of Norse mythology, in a sense. Sleipnir is Odin's 6-legged horse, and Sleipnir was named Sleipnir because for a while it was really our workhorse. It was the most reliable cell that allowed us to do all routine experiments we were interested in. What it is, it's a core holder that can have heaters attached, and they are pretty crude band heaters here. It takes 3.2 millimeter OD cylindrical samples. Usually they are up to 10 millimeters long. The cell can support 30 megapascal confining pressure. We can control the pore fluid, and with these band heaters we can heat the entire assembly to up to about 230 degrees Celsius. I show you this image here, which shows the cell in its parts, essentially completely disassembled, for a couple of reasons. You will notice there is only 3 components which are actually machined. So there's the top and the bottom platen here, and the pressure vessel. Pressure vessel has now changed its appearance slightly, and it's an integrated one. We don't need those legs anymore. All the other parts are essentially off-the-shelf commercial components, be that HPLC components, high-pressure liquid chromatography fittings, or be that Swagelok components that you can just buy off the shelf. So this is actually representing, in a sense, a principle that we have followed for the past years in all of our developments. What we want is modular cells where we can swap individual components, can improve individual components. They're pretty much made from standard materials with a limited amount of machining. They can technically be reproduced in any reasonably capable workshop, right? Before I move on and show you how versatile this particular cell really is, I want to point out that it is also available for general use as a 2BM at the advanced photon source, and that includes the 3 syringe pumps that you need to operate this cell. As I said earlier, the modularity of our cells allows us to adapt them to specific experiments, and this here is a movie from a very fast 1-second tomography experiment where we injected fluids into a limestone, and we wanted to monitor a displacement front in the sample, where we have replaced the aluminium pressure vessel with a carbon fiber pressure vessel to make this cell really ultra transparent. In fact, in this setup it could also be used in a conventional lab CT scanner. You don't need a synchrotron for that, right? What else have we done with Sleipnir? Sleipnir was used for gypsum dehydration experiments here, and these are just some experimental conditions that I indicate here, and to give you a flavor of the sort of data quality that we get with this rig. These are data acquired at APS at 2BM, and indeed you can see here a gypsum rock. This is alabaster progressively dehydrating, forming this hemihydrate here. This is the metamorphic reaction that we're displaying here. Gypsum turns into hemihydrate and releases a lot of water. That reaction goes along with a significant reduction in the solid molar volume, which is expressed here as these pores that form around the hemihydrate grains. But it also goes along with the release of a lot of water, that leads, and you see that there's a difference in the volume between these two, so that leads to pore fluid overpressure, which in tectonics has been considered to be a pretty important ingredient. What sort of images or what sort of data can we acquire from such experiments? What sort of insights can we gain? Just as an example here from a paper that we published a few years ago, where we essentially followed that reaction. Of course, now we can quantify the growth of these grains on the grain scale, while at the same time keeping an eye on what the porosity does and how the porosity evolves. And you can see here that as porosity interconnects between 202 and 255 minutes here, we see that the largest interconnected pore makes up for 81% of the total porosity, and everything that is blue now is interconnected. This interconnection allows the sample to drain the pore fluid pressure, which was shown previously, to feed back on the reaction advance. And in that time interval, we also see a very significant growth spurt in the growth of individual gypsum grain, hemihydrate grains, as we see that here, right? And then we can follow the consolidation of that porosity. Sleipnir does have limitations in the sense that it is a core holder, right? So we cannot really control the stress state in the sample very precisely, and we can of course also not deform a sample in this core holder. So for quite a while we wanted to build a triaxial rig, and again, building on what we had already learned from Sleipnir, we embarked on designing Mjolnir. This is mostly Ian Butler's design here, but you can clearly see there are still components of the original cells in there in a sense. There's a bottom platen here, there's a pressure vessel here, which is the X-ray transparent bit, and there's a top platen, and then up here there's also now an assembly with a hydraulic ram, which you can see up here, which drives a piston. And this now allows us to establish a triaxial stress state. Actually it's a biaxial stress state, because sigma 2 and sigma 3 are the same. This is a deformation rig. It can also take 3.2 millimeter OD cylindrical samples, same length. Roughly we can establish a 50 MPa confining pressure in this cell at room temperature, and exert over 600 MPa axial load. We can control the pore fluid pressure. This cell is also equipped with an LVDT, which is not shown in this image because we've only added it last December. And with the current pressure vessel, although not at these pressures here, we can reach 140 degrees Celsius. You see the same band heaters here mounted to that rig. They also heat that entire assembly here. You could probably go to slightly higher temperatures, but we don't want you to do that if you decide to build one of these yourselves. So this is a very versatile rig that has been used at a whole array of light sources, at APS, at Soleil, at SLS, and at the Diamond Light Source in the UK. And let me give you a flavor of what sort of data it can produce here. This is a paper which should actually be in press by now, or pretty close to, where Alexis has studied the damage evolution in Elsa Craig granite, and essentially she was comparing the effect of introducing heterogeneity into the sample prior to deformation and see what that does. You can see here it gives you a flavor of the sort of images we could acquire at Soleil. These images are now a few years old, and since we have acquired much better ones, but from this data we can follow the porosity evolution here on this hand side, where we compare of course the cracks as a crack porosity and see what they do throughout the experiment. And in this case this is an analysis of the orientation of those fractures, where we see that certain early imprinted orientations actually get inherited and control the ultimate failure geometry. So Alexis showed here essentially that heterogeneity affects the order and predictability of the phase transition to failure, and that is related to the correlation length when that approaches the grain size. Another example here, and I think this is particularly nice in terms of the data quality that we get here. This is another gypsum dehydration example. This is more what I'm working on directly here, and this is work that Sina Marti has conducted, where we looked at the essentially dehydration of gypsum in a setup where the water couldn't drain because the gypsum itself was kept by impermeable halite, so a halite layer, which is something that you would expect in natural evaporites. So essentially the idea there was whether high porphyry pressures that sort of formed during the dehydration, remember that volume difference that I pointed to earlier, whether that high porphyry pressure can be sustained in hydraulically confined and deforming rocks. Right? These are data that are required at a constant differential stress of 8 megapascal, where we deform gypsum halite sandwiches at a range of temperatures and confining pressure, and this was at fundamentally drained conditions. So once the gypsum had made the water released from the gypsum had made its way through the halite, it could drain to the atmosphere. We did find that, by the way, these fluid overpressures could only be supported for very short amounts of time before the water hydrofracted its way through the halite, and this is something you can see here. These are images from a central gypsum layer in the sample and an adjacent halite layer here at different points in time, and you can quite clearly see that there is nice porosity forming in here, which goes along with the reaction of the gypsum, and this is a rendering of the same pretty much in 3D. All of that happens over a very short time scale. Another very exciting rig that we built, well, essentially last year is Stor Mjolnir. Stor Mjolnir, that's Mjolnir obviously being Thor's hammer. Stor Mjolnir is the large hammer. This is a big brother of the cell that I just showed you. This is another triaxial deformation rig, which not only has the advantage that it takes larger samples. Here we can pack in 10 millimeter OD, 25 millimeter long samples, but it also is equipped with 2 piezoelectric transducers to record acoustic emissions from the sample in an active and passive mode, by the way. So this cell here is a fair bit taller than Mjolnir, maybe about not just 2 times the height. It follows a very similar design principle. We have sort of improved on some components. Each new cell, of course, tries to avoid mistakes we've made earlier or things we could have done better previously. But it also has a bottom platen here, manufactured from titanium. It has an aluminium alloy pressure vessel here. There's a top platen here, which also acts as a guide, of course, for the piston. The whole thing again is driven. The piston is driven by a hydraulic ram. These are just off-the-shelf Enerpac rams, which we feed with water in this case to drive the piston forward. And in this particular case here, the ram acts on that component here, which also houses the one of the acoustic transducers, the piezoelectric transducers. The other one sits down here at the bottom, right? A simplified version of this rig will actually be available for general users at the Diamond Light Source from sometime next year onward. The triaxial rig minus the acoustic emission setup. Let me show you very briefly what we do with that. This is ongoing work. I'm not going to go into too much detail because a lot of it is very exciting, but just to give you a flavor of the data quality here, this is a Klashach sandstone. It's pretty good data that we have acquired at the Diamond Light Source. This is an acoustic emission recording from a deformation experiment that we did with the corresponding stress strain curve here. You can very nicely see this is good rock mechanics here, and this is an ongoing analysis that we're working on at the moment with Eddie, where we quantify, of course, the deformation in the sample, in this very particular sample during this experiment here, and we can now, with a very, very high resolution, actually really determine the damage evolution in this sample, so that we pack about 40 scans into the critical periods here of around strain localization and ultimate failure. So in all of our kit, as you sort of saw, we put a significant emphasis on remaining as flexible as possible. So far, all of our cells are modular. We can modify pressure vessels, we can modify top and bottom platens. We have recently done that, for example, for Mjolnir, where we learned from an earlier design that we were not too happy with, and we just reproduced that with we swapped that particular component with a new one. This is very good. That flexibility also extends to our peripheral components, which are also modular, and this is just here a schematic diagram that shows you how we control Mjolnir, for example, but very similar setups we use for the other rigs as well. Essentially, these are high pressure syringe pumps. You can see them here. They're from a German company, Ketone. They are modular. We can add to them, we can remove them. They're easily essentially dismantled and pegged. These feed into some sort of plumbing system with a range of valves, pressure gauges, and those give us the possibility to refuel also these syringes if need be. These components are usually placed next to the stage somewhere via HPLC, high pressure liquid chromatography capillaries. These feed into the cell. These capillaries are mounted in a way so that they can freely rotate with the cell. Most of the capillaries come in from the top. The cell itself here is equipped with heaters, the same here. These are run by a heater controller here, which also is connected to a monitoring system, right? The pumps themselves are driven through software that comes with them, which is highly customizable. That allows us to, it's actually not this laptop here, because the laptop that drives the pumps is outside of the hutch, of course, because we can drive this remotely. Our kit has a relatively small footprint, as you can see. It fits into one large transport box, which we usually ship by courier about 2 weeks in advance of an experiment, and unless we ship it to the US, that always takes longer. And we can very swiftly install all of our setups if we have 2 to 3 trained people on site, and it usually takes about 6 hours. These are essentially showing you the same setups, but with different cells here at different beamlines. This is Sleipnir at 2 BM here in the upstream hutch. And again, here the pumps, the plumbing system that comes with the cell itself. This is Storm Mjolnir setup at the cheap beamline at I-12 at Diamond, where the pumps here are hidden underneath the lead cover. In this particular case, Storm Mjolnir includes an ultra high pressure pump, which we need to drive the top ram here. The top ram, that is because it's a very large volume syringe that we use there, and the plumbing for the confining pressure over here. I want to briefly talk about ongoing developments, stuff that we're working on right now actually. And these are 2 cells in particular. One of them is called Heit Mjolnir, which is the hot hammer in Icelandic, and the other one is Midgard, which I'm going to show you in a second. Both of these cells, they push the frame quite a bit, each in its own way, really. So Heit Mjolnir is, as the name suggests, is still based on the Mjolnir design. And I'm just reproducing here the Storm Mjolnir drawing, actually, because we don't have a specific drawing, a CAD drawing for Heit Mjolnir yet. We're working on that at the moment. But I can still tell you that it is going to be based on this design minus the acoustic emission setup here. It will take a 5mm OD cylindrical sample, 30 MPa PC over a gigapascal axial load here, porphyry pressure control, LVDD, and it will also be able to be heated to 300 degrees Celsius. That is our next benchmark that we want to reach. Those technically versed people amongst you obviously know that heating stuff to 300 degrees, that's where the seals become critical and where everything becomes a little bit more complicated here. So there's 2 significant innovations that we're driving forward here. First, the heaters here are immersed in the cell. We don't heat the whole thing anymore. That is clumsy and not very elegant. So the new heaters will be seated essentially really close to the actual sample, which allows us to get to higher temperatures and allows us a better heat management and very localized heating. The other innovation that we want to implement at Tomcat later this year is essentially a sort of real or near real-time DIC on the projections, actually. So that's image correlation and projections, where we don't acquire data all the time, but we want to use DIC essentially to cut down on to determine when change is actually happening in a sample and only acquire data when it is really relevant. In that case, we hope that we can cut out a significant amount of those data overhead that really is more cumbersome than anything else. This cell, by the way, will also be available for general users at Tomcat in 2 years' time. So that is a deal that we struck with them. Midgard is a game changer for us in a sense, because this is a completely new design, and this is a very early design concept, which I can tell you is not what we will build. We have evolved beyond that, but I can't really show you much of that yet. The key points about Midgard is that it's again a triaxial deformation rig, but it can be heated to 450 degrees Celsius, and it can be pressurized to 100 megapascal confining pressure with a 2 GPa axial load. Again, pore fluid pressure control and an LVDT, which will feed back into the control system. That is the first rig that really allows us to go to proper crustal conditions, and we're very excited about that. So this rig pursues two significant innovations beyond the temperature and the pressure, obviously. So this rig will be mounted on a high pressure rotary union, and it will be spinning continuously, which also means it will allow us to acquire data continuously if we want to. And in order to reach these target pressures, these will be produced in the base of the cell. So there will be no rotating. There will be the whole highly pressurized assembly will be rotating, but it will be rotating as a whole. There will be no capillaries flopping around, so no moving high pressure parts. And this cell will also be available for general users, also at Tomcat from 2023. So this cell is financed through a NERC grant that we are, as is actually Heitmelia, that we're working on at the moment. And part of the legacy of that NERC grant, this is something that we do in the UK, part of the legacy we pass on the equipment that we develop with taxpayers' money. Let me conclude with an outlook. So we are very excited that essentially in the near future, with our transparent cells, we will be able to acquire micrometer resolution 4D data at crustal conditions within a few seconds. And using this data, we will be able to quantify grain scale processes that really have significant influence on large scale tectonics. So this is like obviously a bit of a game changer for us. Through our commitment to open research and existing agreements with beamlines, we will make these cells available to a wider user community. That is the physical cells themselves, but this is also the blueprints. So you may have seen on the earlier slide, Ian Butler just submitted his Mjolnir design to the Journal of Synchrotron Radiation, and that includes the complete CAD drawings. Our own research using these tools will focus on dehydration of serpentinites to better understand chemical, hydraulic, mechanical feedbacks in subduction zones. We will also work on fluid rock interaction in applied case studies on in-situ carbonation and hot geothermal applications, as well as on hydrothermal processes and mineralization. All of these are playgrounds that our tools open up for us. We are very aware that the increasing amounts of data we are producing require novel ways of dealing with them. And one of the things I think we all need to think about is to acquire data more intelligently, not just brute force, because at the end of the day the brute force doesn't really help. On the other side, we are also working very actively with computer scientists to use artificial intelligence to help us interpreting and interrogating our data. And one of the projects that we're very excited about is a weakly supervised 4D segmentation algorithm, where we're currently testing a prototype. Both Ian and I believe that there is a big future in multimodal data acquisition. I think this is also clear to the community. In our case, it is acoustic emissions and X-ray tomography, but there could be other techniques that feed in, diffraction, for example, right? And something that we have a very keen eye on, of course, are the upgrades that are planned or ongoing at many light sources, which will certainly enable much higher pressures and higher temperatures, because we have a greater choice in the sort of materials we can use in our cells. And with that, I want to thank you.